Thanks, for having me, and I apologize that I wasn't here this morning to hear some of the early remarks, and maybe what I have to say overlaps with those remarks. So if they do, please accept my apologies. I want to make sort of 4 points thinking about entrepreneurship within the context of emerging markets. And these 4 points, were generated through correspondence with Bennett for things for us to think about, but they naturally are things that I've been working on in fits and starts, both in the private sector and at the World Bank, and then earlier as an academician and policymaker. The first sort of question, and I think we've been dancing around this to some extent, is entrepreneurship or entrepreneurs in emerging markets, and by emerging markets I'm referring to all developing countries, starting with all due respect from a South Korea down to a Burundi, just using the IMF World Bank definition. Are entrepreneurs in emerging markets, very different, fundamentally different from entrepreneurs in the advanced countries? And, as I think about, this notion that, the Bill Gates, the Steve Jobs, starting in their garages, well, maybe in emerging markets there aren't garages, but it's often someone with a bright idea. And in many cases, that bright idea can come about from a multitude of ways, and that's not unique to advanced countries. At the root, I think a successful entrepreneur who is able to create an invention, diffuse it to an innovation, and then sell it more as a commoditized item. The real crux there is access to markets or access to buyers, right? And this access to buyers could be physical, infrastructure, access to roads, whether it's or trails, whether it's by horse or car or railroad. But there's also, I think, one of the differences with emerging markets versus advanced countries in the access to market question, apart from sort of the hardware, which is what I've just referred to in terms of infrastructure, is what I would call, for lack of just to keep the analogy right, sort of the software. And we talked a little bit about competition policy. Well, in many emerging markets, in some cases, although only recently we're seeing that in the advanced countries, there is a competition policy that's beginning to work. The competition policy regime, or the notion of vested interests in emerging markets, which tend to be quite rife, given the fact that these markets are nascent by definition, they may well be a serious impediment to entrepreneurship becoming as successful as it may be in an advanced economy. And it also may be the case that another part of the software impediments in emerging markets for entrepreneurship, stems from, by extension, sort of regulatory barriers and the like, or the lack of regulation to protect property rights and so forth. But for me, I think the big point, and I've been writing a little bit about this over the last couple of years, is the notion that entrepreneurship begins only in advanced countries, as Ray Vernon, wrote about many, many decades ago when I was in graduate school about the product life cycle. That notion is being turned on its head. The notion of the product life cycle is that it's the advanced countries that are the homes to inventions. As the home country market becomes saturated, and as there are refinements to the product, it becomes a little bit dumbed down into an innovation, and it makes its way to middle-income markets. And over time, as Ray would say, it goes to a very commoditized item and penetrates the emerging markets. And that is one of the theories of multinational corporations and innovation and the like. Well, what we're seeing, and thank God it's happening in my lifetime, is that model is being flipped on its head. So the archetypical example is mobile money, okay? And, for those of us who work in emerging markets and development, we're very clear about when the M-Pesa, in Kenya was invented, almost a decade ago. And we get a chuckle, at least I get a chuckle, when I see all of a sudden Apple and Google, is beginning to create a smartphone, with the ability to pay for things. It's very difficult. It's been very difficult, actually, for several years to take a cab, a taxi, in Nairobi and use cash. I mean, it's an economy that is driven by the use of the mobile telephone, and it's essentially a bank in your pocket. Now, that was not created in the United States. It was not created in Europe. But all of a sudden, we think, oh my God, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. But it's a very powerful example, either by dint of necessity in the emerging market context, where there wasn't that capability before, and engendered by the fact that there is no legacy technology that is a vested interest, in essence, that's standing in the way. There's not an obsolete, lots of sunk costs, legacy technology. And when you face an environment where there's a demand and that there's their absence of someone who's going to get in your way, whether it's the government or other actors, all of a sudden that becomes an environment for invention. And so there are many other examples of inventions making their way backwards from the emerging markets to advanced countries, and I think we're just at the beginning of a trend in that way. Now, in the end, there's going to be a convergence probably, but we can talk about that, separately. But I think the question of whether entrepreneurs in emerging markets are different from advanced countries, I mean, for me, the ultimate answer is not a lot, right, in the reduced form context. The second point is, does the acceleration of globalization in the last 2 decades, the notion that globalization, just started 2 decades ago, is, I think, most of us would agree, is a myth. But is that the new environment, if you will, of accelerated globalization? How does that affect entrepreneurship in emerging markets? And put aside the product lifecycle stuff that I was just talking about, clearly the advent of the web is making less of an information impactedness problem as long as people in emerging markets have access to the web. And again, if you think about the mobile money problem, there's not the legacy. So all of a sudden you're seeing fiber optic, cables in many emerging markets. I live in Georgetown. There's never going to be fiber optic there, through my lifetime, because they're not going to dig up the street. Okay, so globalization is really helping in that regard, assuming that there's free access or easy access to the information flows. But does that mean that globalization means that entrepreneurs in an emerging market should behave differently than before? Well, I think in one respect, yes, that they're going to have greater access to understanding what's going on in other markets around the world. So, the notion of an Uber that, for all practical purposes was invented in advanced countries, but you can now see it in emerging markets. That fact that we're able to be connected, the information flow becoming more efficient, means that entrepreneurs, yes, on the margin are going to behave differently than maybe in earlier periods of time. But I do think, again, the bottom line for me on the globalization question is, at its root, entrepreneurship, at least over history, shows that success at home breeds success abroad. And so it's not like all of a sudden we're in a global market and sort of an entrepreneur think globally from the get-go. I think the lessons from history are that's probably a mistake, and you need to think about, okay, how can I make a go of it? How can I be the best firms or the best entrepreneurs in the domestic market become the best and the fiercest competitors in the broader international market? So in that respect, I don't see, fundamental differences. I think the third point I want to make is just, apropos of the theme of this panel, is the role of government or, policies. And, do they need to change? Well, I think we apart from the technological changes, we sort of know what needs to be done in an economy to foster innovation, whether it's on the education side, whether it's the reducing barriers to access to markets, which I spoke about earlier, but also having regulations that protect the health and safety of the population from innovations or inventions or entrepreneurship that someone makes in their garage in Abidjan, and all of a sudden it's endangering the health of the citizens. So you want to make sure that there's regulation in place there. So I think, again, all those kinds of policies that have been practiced over time in advanced countries and emerging markets, that I think has not changed and should not change. But I do think this question of access to information and the provision of particularly access to the web is a public good, just like education is a public good. And so there, to me, there's a vital role for government, particularly in emerging markets, to help ensure that this is being provided. And if the private sector is not going to do it, which is probably not, or through a public-private partnership, it's going to be government's role. And I would say that if I were a government representative in emerging markets, that's like number one policy apart from the human training issues. And then finally, I think, which is addressing a lot of the work that I've been doing recently, is the social impacts of an entrepreneur in emerging markets. Is it different from the John Rockefellers, if you will, who were not really cared about social impacts other than trying to sell as much oil as he could and killing rivals. In emerging markets, there's often sort of killing two birds with one stone, because these are markets in general where there are cross-sectoral deficits, right? There's a deficit in the financial sector, there's a deficit in the infrastructure, in the health sector, so forth. And as a citizen, as an entrepreneur living in these countries, you're very conscious of that. And you realize that to become as successful as you can, you want to be able to address as much as you can on the margin those cross-sectoral deficits. And so mobile money, to use that example again, came about for reasons because of the lack of banks, and particularly in rural areas. Well, what it has done has created a way of addressing the financial inclusion goal in emerging markets. And so, it started out with a private commercial incentive in some sense, but it's had tremendous social impacts for development, in the markets in question.